Don Byron, many others, other representatives throughout the country at the federal level have raised their concerns as well. At the state level, we're working as much as we can, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that the governor hears our concerns and continues to hear our concerns. But we're also fortunate that we're now having local elected officials and those that want to seek local office making this, the pipelines in Southwest, an issue in Northern Virginia, because all of us need to make this our own issue, because the entire Commonwealth is our backyard. So when you say not in my backyard, we're not talking about her backyard, we're talking about Commonwealth's backyard. And when the person that could tell us that perspective is Linda Sperling, who's running for county supervisor in Springfield, but she wanted to join us today because she wanted to stand with the rest. So you want to come up and say a few words as well?
You guys are so brave. It's amazing. I honestly never climbed a tree because I'm a chicken. I don't even like to climb ladders to change a light bulb. I spent a month in a tree. I don't like to camp. I was pretty much born and raised in Fairfax County. I've never climbed a tree. I don't like snakes. I've camped once, which is very different than, you know, the lifestyle that someone has who does not live in Fairfax County. You know, I live on 1/4 of an acre. You guys live on 400 acres. But we're all Virginians.
Yes.
Whether you're in Fairfax County, whether you're in Roanoke County, whether you're in Richmond, Winchester, Hampton Roads, we're all Virginians. And we all need to stick together. And putting corporate profit over our fellow Virginia residents is not, it's not. I love what you guys are doing, and I don't want to stand in the way of, I know everybody has a lot of questions for Red and for Minor, but I just thank you everyone for being here today, and I want you to know that I and many of us, there are over 1 million people in Fairfax County. I'm going to go out on a limb and say at least 500,000, if not all 1 million of us, stand with you, because like I said, we're all Virginians.
Absolutely.
It's not Fairfax County, it's not Warren County, it's not Roanoke County, it's Virginia.
Yes.
That's right.
And to further amplify the fact that this movement that Red and Minor have helped us ignite the fire for is becoming bigger and stronger and more powerful every single day, our local Democratic parties throughout the Commonwealth have started taking public positions. Loudoun County, Arlington, many others throughout, and Charles, yesterday I think you mentioned what, Albemarle and a few others, and there was a letter that by about 18 organizations, and of course our grassroots organizations, all of our friends who are representing the various different groups that have started, the Indivisibles, the women's groups, and all the other groups that are too many to mention since, I don't know, something happened a couple of years ago that just helped these groups come up. All these organizations have all come together and said, this is an issue for all of us to be aware of. And so you're going to see more and more local elected officials taking positions as well. And I'm also very proud that my own Fairfax County Democratic Committee has also stepped up in a bigly way. And so, thank you all as well. And before I turn this over to John and do some Q&As, I want to show a video from one of our great champions on this issue who couldn't join us today because he's actually out of town traveling for his work. But he wanted to send a message. Now, I know it's going to be a little bit hard to hear, and it's a little bit hard to see here, but I just want you to at least hear the sound, at least if you can't see it, and we'll definitely make sure this goes viral as well. So you're going to see this guy on your Stand with Red hashtags. But here's a little guy that you've heard before, named Tom Perriello.
Hey, this is Tom Perriello. I just wanted to thank Red and Minor and Delegate Keem and Rasul and others for showing incredible solidarity in protecting our clean groundwater, protecting our beautiful Blue Ridge, and protecting a belief that Virginians are in this together. We can sometimes be divided between Northern Virginia and the rest of Virginia, so when we have seen such strong leadership from Fairfax Democrats, from Loudoun Democrats, from our elected officials across Northern Virginia, it speaks volumes, showing that we are standing with those in southwestern Virginia who have too often been forgotten. we are joined by a belief that our kids should have safe groundwater, safe drinking water, that our Blue Ridge should be protected, and that we should be looking at an energy democracy future. We have been so inspired by Red and so many others who stepped up to fight these pipelines. We are still in this fight. We are going to continue to demand a stream-by-stream study and that we go in the right direction for all of Virginia. Thank you so much.
All right. Tom was a champion on this way before guys like me joined this fight, and he's still waging our fight. But the good news is there are many of us still joining and standing with and behind Red and Minor. But for now, let me just turn this over to John Sokolow. Many of you know him. He's been the ubiquitous voice and the person who's made sure every single detail of this issue is out there for us to understand and absorb. Why don't you tell us what's going on, some of the latest updates, what we can be doing specifically, what specific action items are, and then after that, let's do some Q&As, and then I'll wrap up with some concluding remarks and get you out of here so that the rest of you all can go up to, is it Loudoun County, I guess, the next one? Yeah. There's a little beer hall up in Loudoun County that's waiting for Red and Minor to show up. So, John, take it away.
Mark for asking me to speak after Tom Perriello and
of course.
Terry and Minor Terry. Not hard acts to follow, I guess. So just a couple things. I mean, these wonderful activists have covered most of what I would say. I think one of the key points that I'd like to emphasize is there's a role for Virginia in this. And I'll just give you two examples to illustrate that. You do need approval from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to build pipelines. When number 45 took office, there was one member of FERC left out of 5. You need 3 for a quorum. He appointed, when I say number 45, because I don't like using his name, when number 45 decided that he wanted these pipelines approved because the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is listed as one of his top 50 infrastructure priorities, he appointed 2 members to join Cheryl LaFleur, who's the only Democrat on FERC, appointed by President Obama. Those 2 FERC members, new FERC members, immediately took a vote on both the Atlantic Coast and the Mountain Valley Pipeline to approve it. 98% of the pipeline proposals that go before FERC, not only are they approved, they're approved unanimously. But Cheryl LaFleur dissented, which is pretty close to unprecedented. And among the things she said in her dissent was that these pipelines serve no public good, neither one of them. And for that reason, Tim Kaine has stepped out in front and has demanded that FERC have a rehearing, because now FERC has 5 members. It only had 3. And to have a rehearing. Yes. So that's at the federal level. But the way the statutes are set up, you need federal approval plus state approval. And people like to confuse the issue and say, well, the state really doesn't have a role, it's mainly FERC. That's just complete garbage. There's really no other way to put it. There's Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. It's not complicated. There's actually one part of one sentence in Section 401. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand it. It says that if you're going to build a gas pipeline such as this, you need to have the body in the state certify that it complies with state water quality standards. And Virginia has its own water quality standards, as does every state. If you can't get that certification, you can't build the pipeline. That's right. And as Delegate Rasul pointed out, that's exactly what happened in New York. New York's equivalent of DEQ rejected the Constitution Pipeline. The Constitution Pipeline builders went to court. They lost. They appealed to the Second Circuit. They lost, and then they said, we're going to go to the Supreme Court. And just a few days ago, the Supreme Court refused to hear it. So that pipeline is done. That pipeline is done. It's done under the same exact authority, that one piece of one sentence that the Virginia DEQ can act on. The other example I want to give, Red, where she went.
I don't say now.
She mentioned Bottom Creek, which is on her property. I visited Red twice and saw it myself. I took a walk on your property, had a tour of all the destruction there. And this is what I want to tell you. MVP puts out these markers for what they call the line of destruction, this 125 or 150 foot wide easement where they can just destroy everything. It's actually, the term is LOD, which is line of destruction, meaning we have permission to destroy this, okay? Bottom Creek is a Tier 3 stream, not under federal law, under state law. You can just Google Tier 3 stream DEQ Virginia. Just put that in a Google search and you will get to a whole page that explains under Virginia law what a Tier 3 stream is, how you qualify to be a Tier 3 stream, the protections. These are the most pristine streams in Virginia. They are fully protected. Bottom Creek that runs through the Terry's property is a Tier 3 stream, okay? Now, when MVP and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is going to do the same thing, want to mark the line of destruction, they put a little stake in the ground with a little blue and white ribbon, and they write on it MVP LOD, meaning Mountain Valley Pipeline Line of Destruction, okay? I was at Red Sit, and I walked around the property, and not 50 feet from her sit is Bottom Creek. Beautiful, beautiful creek. This leads, I believe, into the Roanoke River, doesn't it? So you're talking about not only a Tier 3 stream, but a Tier 3 stream that feeds into the Roanoke River that feeds hundreds of thousands of people with water. It's their water supply for the whole Roanoke Valley. This stake with the blue and white ribbon was less than 10 feet away from the Bottom Creek. So what they're talking about is bringing in bulldozers, heavy equipment, going along the road, going along the path there, destroying it, digging a trench, okay? It doesn't take a rocket scientist, it most certainly doesn't take a lawyer to understand what happens when you dig up that much dirt to bury this 42-inch pipeline, what's gonna happen to that creek, and what's gonna happen to the water in Roanoke, okay? It's a state issue, okay? And getting back to, as I was talking about with FERC, the question for Virginia is, are you going to cede authority over Virginia's water quality to Donald Trump, or are you going to stand up for Virginia's water under Virginia law and fight it just like we were promised in the campaign last year?
Yes.
Delegate Russell pointed out quite clearly, if somebody tells you, you approach your delegate, if you approach a newspaper columnist, if you speak to Matt Strickler, who's the Secretary of Natural Resources, if you happen to speak to Mark Herring or Justin Fairfax or Ralph Northam or his spokespeople, and they tell you it's a federal issue, really wish we could help you, but we can't, it's just not true. It's just not true. Now, I don't know why they're saying it. Maybe they're not informed. Maybe they're misleading. It doesn't really matter. Virginia has the right, and it's just a very simple question. Who decides on the water quality standards in Virginia in 2018? Is it a decision for Donald Trump?
No.
Or is it a decision for Virginia and these representatives and the Terry family and all of us as Virginians to decide what happens to our water? That's the point. So what we need people to do is to speak up, stand with Red, stand with Minor, stand with Nutty, who's in Giles County on this monopod. They're fighting for Virginia's water. Our politicians need to decide. And we have a wonderful group that's been on board with this. They need to decide if they're going to be on the right side of history, if they're going to stand up for Virginia's water quality, or if they're going to roll over to Donald Trump. It's as simple as that. Thank you very much.
I see some hands, and we are on a college campus, so we're going to do this in a Socratic method, right? We're going to have anybody that wants to ask questions, we'll take it, and whoever wants to answer it, we'll spend maybe 10 minutes or so, and then wrap up with some concluding remarks, and we'll let you all stand with Red so you can get your selfies, all right? So start with a question, and tell us who you are. And
to make a clarification, because I think it's really important, and certainly Jonathan knows so much more about this topic than me, but when we're talking about this issue, to make sure our terminology is correct, and LOD actually stands for limits of disturbance. Just to set destruction, just because when we're talking about this issue, we need to be very clear, I think, about, our terminology. So not to correct you.
No, I popular.
Okay.
It's okay, we're in college.
I agree.
We're in college.
That's a good point. All right, I'm going to go from here's the gentleman there. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Greg Singleton. I live in Springfield.
Okay.
So first of all, thank you, Red and Minor, for what you've done and the attention that you've put to this issue. It's so important to sort of set a precedent in Virginia that we respect the land and the water and the air. So I really applaud what you're doing. But so there's two sort of forms of destruction that will have occurred and could occur as a result of this. Of course, there's the destruction that we're already witnessing with the trees, and now if we don't do something soon, the stumps and then the excavation, the demolition, the destruction of the land. And then after that, we're gonna have the potential of the leak into the water system. So it's very easy for me to understand the destruction of the land piece. Could you explain to me what, sort of what is the basis of the consideration for the leaking into the water system? What is the probability, the likelihood that has occurred on other pipelines, will occur on this one, and what's the nature of it, and what would it do to the water, so we all understand what it is we're facing?
Well, a couple things on that. So the really short, simple answer to your question, pipelines leak. And if you want to see it for yourself, just Google gas pipeline Appomattox, Virginia. And I think, 2008? Yeah. And you will see what can happen to a gas pipeline. It incinerates an area. It blew up, it incinerated an entire area. When these pipelines are built, they use a term, the disturbance zone or the destruction zone or the incineration zone, which is usually about a mile wide. So they prepare for the possibility that they leak and they explode, because we're talking about gas, pressure, a highly pressurized gas. They're going to build.
So it's still in a gaseous form, it's not liquid.
No, that's correct. And you normally, when you build a gas pipeline, you put in a compressor station every 40 to 60 miles or 40 to 80 miles. Virginia has 300 miles in the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. They're putting exactly one compressor station in, and they managed to find an 85% African-American community in Buckingham County called Union Hill, where they want to put that compressor station, where people already suffer from disproportionate amounts of asthma, respiratory disease, and they're going to put it in there. So you have the possibility of the explosion. But it's really more than that, because you're not just talking about digging a hole, putting a pipeline in the ground. You're talking about an infrastructure that starts on the front end with the fracking and ends on the back end with the burning of methane. And so I think the figures are when you frack the methane out of the ground, the average leakage rate is 3%.
Right.
Okay. You've got the possibility of leaking in the pipe. You've got the compressor station. And in the case of Buckingham County, you need power source to operate the compressor station, which you can get from whatever power source you want that can create electricity. Do you know what they're using in Buckingham County to power the compressor station? They're burning the methane in the pipe. Oh. So you're talking about benzene, you're talking about particulate matter, you're talking about 2 historic African-American churches within 1 mile of this pipeline. Okay, one of them was originally an arbor church, where it was the only place that slaves were allowed to worship during slavery era. And the people who live there are the descendants of the people who were slaves in that area. So that's what's going to go into the air there. So you have the methane that's being burned there. Then on the end of the journey there, the whole point is to burn the methane. So the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, I believe, my friend Jason Rylander is more of an expert on this than I am. He's an environmental attorney. But I think about a year ago, the D.C. Circuit came out with a ruling saying that if you're going to look at the expected effects of a pipeline, you have to consider the methane that's being burned, because, as the court said, after all, that is the entire purpose of the infrastructure, is to burn the methane. So methane, as it turns out, is a much more dangerous gas in terms of creating greenhouse gas. I think the Sierra Club has estimated that these 2 pipelines would produce the equivalent of what 45 coal-fired plants will produce. So they like to call it natural gas as if it's something you buy in Whole Foods. It's not. It's a dangerous, toxic, poisonous, carcinogenic substance. The whole point of it is to burn it. To wrap that all up, you've got the leak on the front end when you're fracking, the leak through the pipes, the burning of the compressors to power the compressor station. The possibility of happening to these pipelines would happen in Appomattox, Virginia, absolute explosion. And then you've got the methane being burned at the end. So you wrap that all together.
Let me give you just more specific about the Mountain Valley Pipeline, or both of the pipelines. So the vice president for EQT, Mountain Valley Pipeline, said it would be an engineering marvel to build these pipelines over and through the Virginia mountains. With the steep slopes and what's called the karst terrain in parts of the area, which is like a Swiss cheese underneath. We have the impacts not only to surface water, but also to groundwater. So if you have anything that's leaking and sedimentation and toxins that are released, it goes through the karst and into the groundwater supplies, which poisons private and public wells. But on the surface water, that goes right into our reservoirs. And our reservoirs, if you want to pretend like pipelines don't leak, for example, just the sedimentation, because you're clearing large swaths of land that then goes into the creeks and then the river, that sedimentation goes into our reservoir, which then makes our water, without substantial infrastructure improvements, we can't use it. So that's in addition to the EPA estimating that 10% of all methane leaks come from pipelines. All the methane exhaust that we have come from these pipelines. 10% of all the methane exhaust that we have come from these pipelines. So it hits a lot of different angles for sure, and that's why what happened in, I don't know if you're following what happened in Pennsylvania. Their DEQ came in and just shut down the pipeline right now because there's just so much destruction happening to the aquifers and to the groundwater.
Just one other example on that. I happen to live in Reston, and there's a pipeline that goes, I think it's about 1,000 miles long. It starts maybe in Louisiana, goes up to New Jersey. It's called the Columbia Pipeline. It's not a methane pipeline, it's a gas pipeline. It has jet fuel that goes through. There's actually 2 pipelines. So there was a leak in Reston, right behind Reston Hospital, which is a few minutes from my house, in the early 1990s, leaked an enormous amount of oil there and gas. So pipelines leak. It's just, it's an old infrastructure. Eventually they deteriorate. They might not leak today. They might not leak tomorrow. Eventually they will leak, and in a catastrophic situation, they could explode.
Jonathan,
Yeah.
so one thing about that, as you say, it's not a matter of if they leak, or it's when, because they will. And if you could see the challenging terrain these pipelines are going over, it just is, it's incredible. But what is, I think, really important to know is that in urban areas, the gas is odorized. It won't be odorized. There's no plans to odorize the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So we won't know when the leak occurs until real damage happens.
You heard Red saying that they're not going to have manpower at DEQ to be out there overseeing this throughout. Once they're done, they're done. So it's up to her to discover the leak if and when it happens to a point where you won't even tell the smell, so it's too late. So anyway, yeah,
I just wanted to ask procedurally where with this. I may have been confused. I thought a few months ago that I heard that the DEQ was accepting the Army Corps of Engineers generic approval, that it was just kind of a stamp, okay, boom, we've got approval for all the many hundreds or thousands of water crossings. And whether that's currently the situation and what we're trying to do is get them to revisit that, or if there's some other hurdle that has not yet been reached. If you could just clarify where we are procedurally, because I think that will help focus on what we need to do next.
You're exactly right. So what DEQ decided at the outset when they were reviewing these pipelines is to rely on this Army Corps permit. It's called NWP, which means National Water Permit 12, I guess, to defer to the Army Corps to review many of these 1,100 crossings for both of these pipelines. This became an issue in the Democratic primary last year, when you had Mr. Perriello, who was running, who was firmly against the pipeline, and you had Ralph Northam, who was taking a more nuanced position. So in February of 2017, when Mr. Perriello was, I think, within 5 points of the polls, and he came out of nowhere, he entered very late, Ralph Northam sent a letter to DEQ, which he then talked about the night he sent it in a debate, where he said specifically we should not be deferring to the National Water Permit 12 for the Army Corps of Engineers. Virginia should do its own, what he called site by site, in other words, stream by stream analysis. So we are calling that the Northam standard. Okay. What happened, and then Ralph Northam went on to say, I brought the concerns to their attention, and they've agreed that they're going to do that, which they did for 6 weeks, and then long about I think May or June, they said no, we didn't really mean that. We're just gonna examine the stream crossings in a portion of the pipelines, but in the other portions, which was the majority of these 1,100 crossings, we're still going to defer. Okay, so all we're asking for is for Ralph Northam to direct the Department of Environmental Quality to adopt the Northam standard and go back to what he advocated during the campaign, which they are not doing. And the real problem, to get to your question, is the Army Corps is not doing it. So nobody is examining it. What's happening is families like the Terrys are going out and taking pictures and giving them information. As she mentioned, there's many of these streams and creeks that aren't even on the maps that MVP is providing to the.
What do you think his reluctance is to adopt the northern?
I'm not a politician, but.
So there are, you know, it's all big money politics, so let's just say what it is, but. There were three bright stars that came together at the same time. So number one was Red and Minor, and others who are in Giles County, Nutty, et cetera, who are, and maybe in Franklin County. That's number one. Number two, finally, after a long time, a bold, direct voice from Northern Virginia, led by Mark Keem and several others, finally had this press conference a few weeks ago and said enough is enough, which was excellent. And then a big surprise happened. The State Water Control Board met several weeks ago, and about the same time said, you know what? We want to actually learn about the stream-by-stream analysis. And they said, we actually are going to have a 30-day comment period, public comment period, and take comments about whether or not we should have a stream-by-stream analysis done. Much to the surprise of DEQ and the administration. And we're in the middle of that 30-day comment period right now, which was kind of a little bit of a godsend. And those three created this perfect storm, because now we have an opportunity for the State Water Control Board to come forward and say, no, we demand a stream-by-stream analysis.
How long does that comment period run?
30 days, about until the end of May.
So y'all write too, everybody can write.
Absolutely.
It's public comment.
Where did those comments go?
They go directly to the State Water Control Board.
Well,
Well, yeah.
Following this, we'll do the call of action with all the specifics of who, when, what, all that. So we'll definitely do that.
Yeah, the comments go, I think, to the Department of Environmental Quality. So if you go onto the DEQ website, Pipeline, it'll tell you where to direct comments. But just following up on what Delegate Rasul said, the State Water Control Board, which is, I think, 7 members appointed by the governor, directed that this comment period happen. DEQ has reinterpreted what the Water Board has called for and said, you know what, we're not going to submit all these public comments to the Water Board. We're going to summarize it for them. Okay, so the process is, to use the phrase, rigged. And I don't know why, but it doesn't matter.
So
The State Water Control
let's hear from a
Board.
couple more comments here. I mean, definitely hear everybody. Yeah.
Kind of follow
Sure,
up
sure.
now. I think I'm kind of involved with this subject, and I'm confused. Wasn't it the water board that went to Harrisonburg and testified before back in the fall?
Yes.
And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of testimony given about why we needed to testify, why each stream needed to be tested, why, you know, everything. I thought, is that not the same group we're talking about?
Yeah.
So what, they didn't listen to us when we
You had
testified
members of
before?
DEQ there, and I think that there was an uproar. I mean, you all created so much attention after December, which is when they initially ruled, which you had referred to. And there was a nuance in the ruling for the 2 pipelines, but there was so much of an uproar. And then there was some subsequent folks who were able to educate individual members of the Water Control Board that, you know, these people are citizens who were appointed. And then after having those conversations, on a 5-to-1 vote, they voted, no, we want to have this 30-day public comment period. The state has the authority to suspend the 401 certification while we do the stream-by-stream analysis. So we know that there's more that the state can do.
So they're having second thoughts in their initial decision is what's happened, because they did make a ruling on it originally.
Let me tell you, let's put it this way. We are very happy that the State Water Control Board has decided to learn more about it. And we are thankful to the State Water Control Board.
Yes.
Because we appreciate that they have done that. So thank you to them.
Sure. A couple more, back behind you, Steve. Yes.
I'm just curious, because I really have been not paying attention to the DEQ and to the State Water Board. Who are these people
they placed on these boards? What's their decision-making authority? Because they have such power over us. And we'd like to have them be representing the community, not Dominion or big money interests.
Let me answer this briefly this way, because it's a much bigger conversation. Virginia has a very limited form of government compared to a lot of other states. We only have 3 statewide elected offices. Most states have 5, 6, 7. California has like 15. So some states have a lot of elected offices. Some state houses and state senates in other states have dozens and dozens of members, and they meet all throughout the year. Virginia has one of the shortest sessions of the legislature. We only meet 60 days one year, 45 days another year. We're part-time. And so Virginia has this long tradition of having a very powerful executive branch. That's just always been the rule. The trade-off is that the executive branch is very powerful, but he only serves 1 term. So the governor goes in for 1 term, does whatever he or she thinks that he can get done, and then when he's done, he can't run for re-election. The legislature is weaker, but we stick around a lot longer. So that's been the balance in Virginia. That's been around for a long, long time. And what that means is that when the legislature can't act proactively during session, passing bills and setting the policies, which is only very limited, when we can't do that, the rest of the time, the governor himself gets to appoint 3,000 people throughout the state, including the state boards, all the transportation. Some of you know, the Virginians know about the I-66 expansion here, which is a horrible project I'm opposing, expanding it and adding tolls. That came through the exact same way. There's a group called the Commonwealth Transportation Board. Commissioners are appointed by the governor. So they, away from us, separately come up with these rules that say, we're gonna build this and we're gonna spend money this way. And so the executive branch is extremely powerful in Virginia. As a result of that, the DEQ is appointed by the governor, the water board members are appointed by the governor, and the governor, using his whatever political reasons or whatever personal reasons, decides to stack them with the people that he wants, and for the 4 years, they have absolute right to rule. That's why the only way that we can change the process right now is for us to put more public pressure, right? If you've got 7 members of the public sitting on that, we have 7,000 members weighing in. Hopefully that'll outweigh that voice of the 7 political appointees. So that's just the quick version of how government in Virginia.
So are you, in terms of being just one constituent, is our voice most effective going to the governor's office or going to these boards?
Both.
Okay.
Both. Stephen had his hand up, and then we'll come back to the reporters here. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to go to what Red said and about the proximity to where they bulldoze to the streams. You said it was like, just how much was that, the distance?
Actually, one of the blue and white lines of destruction, my creek is here. I have a tree here, and they put that there.
Okay,
The line of destruction.
so if it's that
they
close.
were this far from going into.
Yeah, has
my
somebody
place.
thought about a lawsuit that's directed at the bulldozing? Because isn't it inevitable that if they start building this big trench, that sediment is gonna go into these streams?
Oh, that's a given.
Right, exactly, that's almost automatic, right? So, and that should be stopped until such time as all these 23 streams are analyzed on your
One
property.
stream, 23 crossings.
Or 23
on the same
crossings.
thing.
You could,
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody's thought of this, but file a lawsuit, irreparable damage occurs at the very moment that the bulldozing starts, because the bulldozing itself will get all that sediment into the water.
That would be a good idea, except for the bulldozing is gonna start over the hill, down the road in my neighbor's yard. So by the time that they go ahead and rake everything through her yard, up the mountainside, back down to my creek, they've done a lot of destruction. And then we're gonna have the runoff from just that, before they even cross the creek and get on the other side, they're gonna bulldoze all this. And then they're going down just 200 yards, and then they're gonna cross the creek again, go up through my wetlands, go through the brook, go through the stream, go through another marsh, and then up in my 100-year-old apple orchard that they have already taken down.
Well, maybe you can get together with your neighbors on such a lawsuit, but the lawsuit would be very, very narrow, leading to the bulldozing and the impact of the sediment once they bulldoze on the water, and they would have to do this analysis of that impact before they could start bulldozing. I mean, it's a pretty simple, straightforward,
We're gonna-
irreparable injury kind of lawsuit.
It's a good thing to pass on to their lawyer.
Great
for
idea,
sure.
and there are obviously lawyers
Yeah.
working on this, both for individual level and wider level. For our purposes today, if we can have a conversation about what the public can do, not just to help Red and Minor and Nutty and all the other folks who are being impacted, but as a state, what kind of state do we want, and what kind of pressure can we put on the political part of this? Sir?
Yeah, I'm a journalist. I'm not from Virginia, but it's my understanding that former Governor McAuliffe had some kind of deal with oil companies to essentially give them beyond $58 million, I believe it, a waiver of damage. So if there is beyond that kind of damage, what are they supposed to pay for the damage to their property? I mean, it seems like if, obviously lives are most important, but if there's a lot of damage on people's property, who's going to pay for that if the oil companies have this exemption from the former governor?
Yeah, so 2 days after Christmas, in the cloak of secrecy of the holidays, two agreements were signed, one for MVP and one for ACP, together for about $80 million, which limited the liability, especially during the construction period. So they kind of bought their insurance plan. We found out about it many weeks later.
Merry Christmas.
Yeah, we found out many weeks later, and I actually put in a substitute bill to one of my pipeline bills to nullify those two agreements, and then to put a bonding requirement, which would be roughly about $1 billion for this project, as opposed to $27 million. But I do need to say there was a lot of good work, and there's a lot of wonkiness around that, but in essence of time, I do need to tell you that a lot of the great grunt work in understanding and digging up what was happening behind the scenes with these agreements was done by none other than John over here. It was the work was so good that the Secretary of Natural Resources himself decided a couple weeks ago to write his own op-ed in defense of the agreements, and they published it in the Roanoke Times. So you can see the other side if you would like. But just a thank you to John.
Kathy?
Let me say one thing real quick.
Sure.
So I'm all in it. I'm all in this fight, and thank you for what you're doing. It really touches all of us. But the stream by stream analysis makes it seem like, well, still this has to be built. I think also I'd like to concentrate on that this pipeline is worthless, and will probably.
Yes.
So let's not forget that, because when we say the stream by stream, it means, it feels like to me we're finding a way to get it done, which I feel like we should try to point out as much as we can that this is really a waste of money, and just to what's happening to your property, and just so you know that it just really hurts us all. So we're gonna be here for you. Yeah, I like.
Great point. So no pipelines, no pipelines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No pipeline.
There's a logic tree here. We believe that when the stream-by-stream analysis is conducted, because if we just go to these folks
Right.
and we don't tell them what the first step is, they're gonna be like, we can't do anything as they've been telling us. When we do a stream-by-stream analysis, it's going to prove there is no way you can build these pipelines and not destroy our water resources. It is going to be the objective evidence that's going to say it's very clear to us crossing these bodies of water over 1,100 times.
There's no public benefit.
Yeah.
There's no.
In the end, it's a scam, and it will be not even used properly.
Amen to that.
Absolutely.
So that's the logic tree behind stopping, because then we can deny the water permits.
Yeah,
at that
and
point.
your point is so good that I think we'll hear a couple more people. We're gonna close with that thought and kind of take this conversation a little bit higher level. So behind you, and then John.
And I was just gonna add to that, I live in Southwest Virginia, a couple of things that I've been thinking about, there's also a difference that I think, and I grew up in Central Virginia, that I learned at a water event a number of months ago that I did not know before, is that in Northern Virginia, Central Virginia, some of the flatter lands, people are drawing off of water that is 300 years old. In Southwest Virginia, because of karst terrain and the way the mountains are laid, people's well water is at best 30 years old. So that is a huge, so from my heart, this is a great opportunity for all of Virginia to really support Southwest Virginia, and to say, you know what, a lot of times you guys out there get the tough end of the stick, but we are here for you, and this is why, because we're affected in a way that is so different. I think, than the rest of the state. And the other thing I was thinking about with especially with stream, any way that we can light up these folks, from the governor to DEQ, everyone, that to me, having visited both of the tree sits all the way down the line, our goal is delay, delay, delay any and every tactic that we can use to delay this process so that these things can happen, that will prove, like Sam mentioned, that this project is dangerous. It will allow the attorneys so much more time. There are lawsuits and appeals happening from Richmond to Roanoke right now. And if we can if we can just hold them out. Another big thing, we were just at the Dominion shareholders, meeting and had a rally there. The other thing that's happening throughout this process is the stock price is dropping. And if we use every single tactic we have to delay the project has to happen. The pipe has to go in the ground by the fall of 2020. If heavy-duty investors start to see that these deadlines are not going to be made, they're going to start pulling out. They're going to start divesting, and that is a really key thing in all of our efforts.
Wonderful point. Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
You'll be the last person.
Okay, John Boyer. I'm very active with the Nova Climate Group that had the Mother's Day Climate Rally with a number of delegates who were there. It was great. My question is this. Throughout this whole process, I testified down in Harrisonburg and so on, is the PSR, Physicians for Social Responsibility, major study, 83 pages, too dirty, too dangerous, about factual stuff about the toxic elements of methane gas. Why is it that Ralph Northam, who's not only a physician, he's a pediatrician, right? Why hasn't more pressure been put on him as a pediatrician, as a physician, about these health hazards associated with the pipelines? We had a meeting with Tim Kaine, our Ornova group, about a month ago, and Tim Kaine said, you're right, the health hazards of the pipe. I said, they haven't been given the attention that they should. There's been arguments about eminent domain and all this other stuff, but the health hazard, which is long lasting, and the proof is in, studies are in. Why hasn't more of that been brought to bear on Ralph Northam as a physician and governor?
Well, the answer is it has been. The Southern Environmental Law Center, which is doing a lot of the litigation, has done really groundbreaking work, and they published a piece which I wrote about in Blue, Virginia, where they went through, in incredible detail the health effects of these pipelines, and those documents were filed in lawsuits against FERC, and they were filed in lawsuits against DEQ. So the state government, your question I know is particular to Ralph Northam personally, but the state is aware of it. It's no secret. The studies are out there.
Isn't that put to Ralph Northam personally as the governor? It should be more often, I would think.
Well, I personally spoke to Ralph Northam during the campaign because he was at a climate change event, and I went up to him and I told him the story of Buckingham County, and I specifically said to him, about the health effects of benzene in a particular matter. And you know what he said to me? He says, we'll look into that. It's the last we heard of it.
Well, I feel like we need to put more pressure on him. That's an unacceptable answer.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. And we aren't doing enough to pressure him as a physician. Yeah. He should know about this. He needs to recognize this. He can't have these vague answers. I don't feel like we're doing enough. I like Ralph Northam. I remember when he got, he said, the doctor is in, right? Well, he's not in on this issue. He's absent on this issue.
Absolutely.
My name is Mike Higgins. I'm a human being. A little more than that. And that should be enough for this issue in my mind. I wanted to make a point, reinforce a point, then I have a question for our delegates on this issue. I think any one of the issues that this pipelines issue touches should be enough to stop them. It's an environmental issue, which we've talked about. It's a private land issue, the use of eminent domain with no public benefit, no identifiable public benefit. So we've got a terrible precedent being set there. It's a personal safety and health issue, which has been mentioned by a number of folks here, and it's an economic issue. The most mind-boggling thing about this is that all the jobs are in renewables. And this is going to affect all of us economically as ratepayers, whether or not that gas is used and likely used outside the state of Virginia. Jonathan's exposed the fact that he had a fifth that it's a racial issue, and we've talked a little bit about that in Buckingham County. But I would also say it's not just a Virginia issue, and I want to thank Jordan Sheraton, who I see over there. This is a national issue. This isn't just happening in Virginia. This is happening all over the country, so it's that much more important. I say all that because it's also not just a Democratic issue. These are themes that cross the political spectrum. We had a candidate for governor, Cliff Hyra, who ran as a libertarian, who would have been right up here with you on this issue. And I'm curious, where is there opportunity? Who is stepping up outside the Democrats? And I want to commend the two of you, because I know it can't be easy putting people before party, but we need more people like that. And it's been encouraging to see so many Democratic voices stand up despite inaction in the top office in the state. But who else is standing up, and what opportunity is there to reach across the aisle on some of the issues that are affected here?
So the Mountain Valley Pipeline will, to your point, create 34 permanent jobs. And that is what they published in the FEIS. And I can show you that. That's like a small restaurant.
Yeah.
There'll be several thousand during construction. On both pipelines, but that's all temporary. So when you talk about jobs, it's really all nonsense. It's a bunch of wealthy folks who want to export this stuff as fast as they can because it's a lot of dollar signs. So $3.5 billion project just for the, and over $7 billion for the ACP. You can imagine they're fine tying things up in court after the fact. That's why we have to do things now before, for sure. You're exactly right that there is enormous opportunity. Now, I understand what state, this is Fairfax County? Yeah. Okay, I understand I'm in Fairfax County and I'm about to say something that probably isn't as quite as exciting. When I talk, I like to talk mainly about the impact to drinking water. So there are issues, right? Renewables, natural gas, fracking, all these different issues, and you get to drinking water, the impacts on the environment, eminent domain. All right, I talk a little bit about eminent domain to hook people in because it does cut across the spectrum, but everybody cares about their drinking water. The key is, and this is important for lots of issues, is you have to understand how are you going to build that broad appeal. And if you build that broad appeal using one set of arguments, you're going to turn off other folks. So I like to figure out what's the most inclusive way of talking about this issue. I think it's clear abuse of eminent domain because the public interest is not there. But specifically as a state legislator, the state has power. The state has power in protecting our drinking water. And so that's where I think people should focus as we move forward.
I'll just vouch for that because my mother's a staunch conservative, and she 100%, one of your press conferences about the clean water changed everything for her.
Okay. So we promised to get everybody out of here at 4:30. So we've got a couple of comments here, especially from folks who've already spoken. Something now, or do you want to wait till so we can after we wrap up? Just quick. Okay.
Just very quickly. So the reason I asked about the leaking is because it seems to me, unless you correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me there's only two legal ways to stop the pipeline, within the law. I don't think the legislative body in Virginia can do anything. I think it's, if you accept that the FERC ruling is done, maybe it's not, maybe they can do a re-ruling because of the members, but if you accept that that's done, there's only two legal ways to get through this. Either challenge the eminent domain use, which I think has a very, very good standing to be overturned because it's improper use, but that's a very legalistic argument. The second way is to challenge the cleanliness of the water, like you said. Those are the only two ways to stop it. All this talk about, even though how bad the methane is and how much leaking is going into the air, that's really super bad. It's really super bad to talk about how bad fracking is for the earth, and we shouldn't be fracking gas at all. I mean, that's all great, but it isn't going to stop the pipeline. Two ways to stop it: eminent domain or water. And water is the Water Control Board and the DEQ, right? So that's what we got to concentrate on.
Our friends from Americans for Prosperity, they love natural gas, but they hate the abuse of eminent domain. And if you can talk to them, and I I say that genuinely. They would love for you all to go and watch this movie Little Pink House, which is just coming out, talking about a woman who fought a battle and won in New England against eminent domain. So
Okay, so let's do this. First of all, let me thank you all for making the time today. It's been an hour and a half since most of you have been in this room, and we really appreciate that. This press event wasn't designed to give you every answer. It wasn't designed to come up with strategies for us to move forward. It was designed to get you to be woke in the common parlance nowadays of how this issue impacts all of us. And that, yes, in fact, there is something that every single one of us, regardless of where we live or what our position in life is, that we can actually do something about. So that was our first standard, is to just get you aware and to be engaged and to be motivated. Second, though, is when we leave this, starting the moment this is over, I want every one of you to connect with each other and identify groups that you want to be part of. Like Mike laid out and so many other people did, there are so many different parts of this. It isn't just a one thing. It's not somebody coming in and saying, I want to take your tree and I'm going to take it now. Tree is just one of the 1,000 different issues that we're talking about here. And so to the extent that you feel that there's one particular thing that speaks to you more than another, whether it's water, whether it's eminent domain, whether it's healthcare or racial injustice or whatever piece of this, there are groups already working on this. But one thing that's in common with every one of our groups that are working on this, whether they're paid lawyers or strategists or nonprofits or politicals or others or landowners, one thing that everybody has in common is there aren't enough of them. There aren't enough of them working on the issue. So if you all can add that extra people and extra resources, and if you can't do anything else, just write a check. I'll tell you where to write a check too, but whatever you can to add more to the ongoing projects. That's the first action item. And if there's something that's missing, and Greg, you pointed out some really good points. If there's something that's missing that we haven't thought of yet, not we as in me, but the collective we, if we haven't thought of something, that could be a really helpful way for us to move forward. Brainstorm with us, and let's come up with that, and then we'll engage our grassroots groups, we'll engage our lawyers, smart people, and they'll come together and put together a team, and they'll work on that as well. But finally, let me just put it this way. I want to thank Red and Minor, and we still have Nutty in our hearts and minds and our prayers, and the others that are still valiantly fighting up in the trees. We thank you, because every major event in history, every major change in history, whether it's an evolution or a revolution, happens when one person does something out of the ordinary. When one person decides to take him or herself out of the comfort zone and not go with the flow, but to do something a little bit different. They might get ridiculed, they might get called out, they might be ostracized, but they think in the heart of hearts it's the right thing to do. That one person can start the ripple effect that eventually becomes a revolution that changes human history. We've seen this over and over and over again in the last 10,000 years. We've seen brave men and women, many of them nameless, many of them faceless, who take that first step to start changing the way things are, to challenge the status quo. 50 years ago, we had people like Martin Luther King that took the fight for racial justice and stepped up. 60 years ago, we had people like Rosa Parks who decided that the discrimination wasn't right. And so they decided to step up. They faced dogs and water hoses and lynching. They faced jail time. And yet our country, for the most part, is better because they stood up. Environmental protection, sustainability, energy usage, efficiency, the idea of stopping stupid things from happening, the idea of not destroying our planet even more than we've already done so, the idea of stopping climate change in any way we can through man-used products and services. This is a human and civil rights event and agenda and movement of our lifetimes. I love the women's rights movement. I love the LGBT rights movement. I obviously love the immigrant rights movement. I love all these great movements that are happening. And I'm just out there with the young folks on the gun right, gun control, and the fight for our rights for public safety as well. And I'm all for giving our kids college tuition and everything we can to make sure our kids have the brightest days. But none of those issues that Sam and I work on, we have 3,000 bills a year in the General Assembly. None of those 3,000 bills that we deal with is anywhere as remotely as important as this. Because if we don't do something now, if our generation doesn't do something now, then we will leave this planet worse off than the folks that walked this earth 2,000 years ago. And that is not something that we can be comfortable with. And so we now have to literally stand with Red, because she did something extraordinary. And mine did something amazing. They decided against all odds to stand up and fight the establishment, stand up against corporate greed, stand up against government that wasn't listening to them, stand up against the idea that your property doesn't matter in Virginia anymore, stand up to the idea that the environment is no longer something that we should be adhering as such a sacred thing. They stood up against everything that we always believed in and yet have changed. So I think if there's anything that we learned today with all of us gathering today and all the other activities that are going on, and I want you to keep staying with them, follow them online, go to show up, start telling your friends about what's happening here and join the movement. But as you do so, let's just think about this one thing. We have a chance here in Virginia to stop business as usual. We have a chance right now to stop politics as usual. And as somebody who's been in politics for about 9 years in elected office and about 20 years before that in various different jobs, what I realize is the reason why we have politics as usual now, the reason why we have this corruption and too much money influencing and too many people being comfortable and wanting to kowtow to their favorite lobbyists and take these corporate positions, and the reason why they feel like they have to take cover behind fig leaves is because we are part of the problem. I'm part of the problem. As a candidate for office, I say stupid things just to get elected. And then I don't hold myself accountable when I get elected. Politicians across the board say stupid things just so that we can kowtow to all of you. And then when we're in office, we say, oh, no, we never said that. I don't remember saying that. I can't help you with that. Because we get so comfortable with the idea of holding the title. Well, politics as usual has to stop. It's no longer enough for you to hold the job. You gotta do the job. And so what I wanna do, starting this moment, thanks to Red, thanks to Minor, and thanks to all of you joining this fight, let's change Virginia's political landscape, in addition to protecting the environmental landscape. So with that, I want to thank you once again for joining us. The fight has just begun. It's going to get stronger and louder and bigger, and as we get more motivated through Red and through Minor and through all of you, let's get out there and keep standing with them, and let's make it the best we can, and let's stop the stupid pipelines from ever happening in Virginia.
Start over here. So there you have it. This was a press conference with delegates from the House of Delegates in Virginia. You have folks from all over Virginia here in the audience. Obviously, Red Terry and Minor Terry, who were protesting at the top of their trees on their property in Bent Mountain for over a month so that they wouldn't cut down their trees. The oil company needed the trees cut down in order to survey the property and then put the pipeline through. So they stood up basically for over 30 days atop their treehouse. You also have one protester now is still up there for 6 weeks. I don't know her actual name, but they call her Nutty. So if you Google Nutty, that's fine. Nutty is atop a mountain, Peters Mountain, Virginia. She's atop kind of a monopod. It's not even an actual tree. They're taking a crude picture over there. And there's other tree protesters also in Franklin County. So there's still active tree protesters up in Peters Mountain and Franklin County, basically blocking them, trying to delay them pipeline construction. So basically it seems like kind of a battle plan to basically put pressure on the governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam, who, if you recall, the Democratic National Committee, Tom Perez, all those fundraising emails, we have to elect Ralph Northam in Virginia last year. Well, he's the governor now, and he is looking the other way as they put a natural gas pipeline through the Appalachian Trail, which is some of the most pristine land and water we have in the country. So they are basically talking about how we could put pressure on Northam, also how we could put pressure on the state environmental department, DEQ, which is important. So hang out for a minute. I'm going to try to get some interviews right now. You know, people in the audience are talking to. There was an environmental attorney here, a few delegates who are elected in the House of Delegates in Virginia. One of them I've interviewed the other day. His name's Delegate Sam Rasool. And basically, people are fed up. People are fed up. And I think one person pointed out, this is not just a Virginia issue, this is a national issue. Because you literally have these pipelines going through people's property all over the country. I've covered it in North Dakota, obviously. I've covered it in Texas. I've covered it in North Carolina, covered it in Indiana. You have pipelines being used to, they're getting permission of eminent domain to put pipelines through people's property. These pipelines, 99.9% of which, the gas, which is being liquefied, is going to foreign countries. It's not even being used like the oil companies say it's going to be used. So it's pretty much a giant scam. And people are starting to wake up to it and fight back. So, and there has been victories. In New York, there was just a victory against the Constitution pipeline, where the New York Department of Environmental Quality said no to the Constitution pipeline because of its risks. So let's walk over here for a minute. La-da-dee, la-da-da. Try to talk to that fella. You'll have to wait. Any comments, questions, concerns? Okay. Always fun trying to wait for these folks. I got it. La-da-dee. You see Red Terry and her daughter Minor Terry talking to people in the audience. You have delegates here talking. And I believe this is the environmental attorney with the glasses on that has been doing a lot of work on this pipeline issue. So we're going to try to talk to him. Go over and yeah, Democratic delegates. And one of them was pretty straightforward in saying, yeah, they're all bought off. And that's why they're putting these pipelines through. So we, I'm seeing this in state after state after state after state. And also in Texas, of all places, they literally are putting a pipeline called the Trans-Pecos pipeline through that's going underground into Mexico. And during the pipeline permitting process, the oil company, Energy Transfer Partners, who was the parent of the Dakota Access Pipeline, literally did not even say in its permitting process with FERC that it was going underground into Mexico. It's literally a pipeline going underground into Mexico from the United States. That's kind of unprecedented. Well, Canada, pipelines go from Canada into the United States. But this pipeline in Texas wasn't even put in the permits. The oil company lied to FERC, not even announcing that. So it's kind of shameful, the scam that is going on, and it's people's water at stake. It's people's water at stake. So Sam from Texas says, yep, sounds about right. Yep, I agree. So we'll wait just a minute to try and interview the attorney. And like they said, they're trying to kind of put together groups that could kind of group up and do quite a lot of activism together. You have a minute? Oh. There we go. Oh, sure. Your delegate, I missed your
Mark Keam, K-E-A-M.
interesting to me about this is they keep going to the state. The state says do anything, but he was saying it's just simply not true. Do you think the state is kind of misguided or kind of just purposefully looking the other way?
Well, I'd say there are probably two ways of looking at this. One is the state's attorneys and others in that position are taking a more conservative view. That, I mean, obviously the language of the law is the same, it's black and white. But some people might say, well, just because we have the authority doesn't necessarily mean that we should use that authority fully because of precedent or history. If we're doing this now, then every time there's an issue like this, we have to get involved every single time. And do we want to set that precedent, right? So that might be one possible interpretation. And that's, in the policymaking world, that's a legitimate thing for people to say. The other interpretation is to say, well, regardless of what the state's authority is, we really don't have the clout to be able to do much other than what it is now. In other words, even if we did exactly what you want us to do under the code, under the language that we have, the end result is going to be the same anyway. Therefore, the federal government's rules or decisions are going to be the ones that are ultimately going to be standing. So why bother wasting our time as the state officials doing all this stuff when the end result isn't going to change? So those are, I would say, are the two ways that you can read the inconsistencies with what we believe the state has the authority and what our state officials are telling us. Well, I'm not sure if we have the authority.
And I mean, let's keep it real. Governor Northam and a lot of these other people have taken money from oil and gas. I'm not saying they're purposely risking people's lives, but there's politics at play here, particularly ones that might have future considerations. Do you think they need to be listening more to clean energy types, environmentalists, and kind of say, well, this is unprecedented to put two pipelines like this through the Appalachian Trail?
Well, it's not only unprecedented, but it's something that is not necessary at all. So it's one thing to take massive risks if it's going to benefit thousands and thousands of people. But something that we know documented is not going to help Virginians because we already have several other pipelines in Virginia that's at half or less capacity. So they can easily fill that capacity before they build new ones. So the fact is it's not only unnecessary and not economically feasible, but it really doesn't end in any kind of a public benefit. So it's not something that we should be doing. But I guess the cynical side of me says, yeah, there's always politics and there's always influences and what have you. But the reality is I honestly believe that Governor Northam and his senior people don't see the problem the way we see it. Because if they saw the problem the way we see it, there's no reason. And I'll give my friend Ralph Northam the full benefit of the doubt. He is a friend. I supported him in his campaign. I still support him. I work with him very closely. I really just think that it's an honest difference of opinion about what they think the impact is. We believe the impact is dire. We believe it's horrible. We believe there's no reason why this should go through. Maybe they see some benefits there that I just don't see. So I don't want to go down the road of, well, obviously there's and influence.
I'm a little more cynical, but
yeah, I'd like to think that maybe they just believe that there's more benefit that comes out of this, and that's the part that I'm trying to convince them, and hopefully others are convincing them that there really is no benefit.
It's interesting to me. Obviously, in this country, very difficult. I mean, it's so polarized. But people have talked about this is an issue that we could draw in conservatives with, because I was in Texas covering a pipeline. It was going through some pretty conservative people's backyards, and they were up in arms. As a delegate, how do you think people in Virginia, but around the country that might be watching, have pipelines going through their country? How do you bring those two groups together for this? Because water is kind of bipartisan.
Water is life, and we literally need water, clean water. That's something that every single person in America will stand on. I think the issue is that a lot of Republicans who especially aren't in the affected areas have probably just tuned themselves out. They just say, hey, this is a big business thing, it's jobs, it's economic opportunities. I've always said those things in my campaign, so I'm just going to stick with that. And I don't have time or the energy to really dig down and find the actual footnotes on how many jobs it'll create. So they've probably just taken the easy way out of saying, hey, it's pro-business, it's pro-jobs, pro-economy, I'm for it. And they don't think any more about that. I think when they actually sit down and talk and think it through, and when they actually meet constituents who are in their area, who will tell her, this is what's going to happen. My house is going to be taken away from me. Why are you letting my house be taken for something that I'm not even going to benefit from? When you have that level of conversation, I think some of them will come around. And I'm really hoping, again, I've tried absolutely hard throughout this process over the last few months on this issue. I've tried really hard not to make this a Democrat versus Republican issue. What I've said is I'm glad to see my own party coming around, because that by itself is a challenge. Frankly, I'm disappointed that so many of my own colleagues and so many other Democratic Party activists have said, this is their issue, Southwest, it's not our issue. We shouldn't be worried about this. It is our issue, because if we stand for good quality environment, good protecting the environment, and less fossil fuel energy, this is a pipeline that's going to generate continuously dependent on the fossil fuel that we have. So this is something that's no-brainer for me. So from that perspective, what I'd like to see is not only Democrats, but Republicans just be more educated and come around and understanding the facts, and then agreeing that, yes, in order for us to protect the water, there really is only one solution, which is not build this.
Well, it's also, I mean, traditionally, the Democratic Party is the party of the people, right? Well, the people are very scared and angry, and you don't really about, kind of extreme conservatism, kind of Republican light. And I think that's what we saw nationally in 2016. A lot of progressives and environmentalists want to see stronger, stronger voices from the Democratic Party against threats to water, threats to land. The deforestation going on is a major player in climate change. Not just north of them, but the entire Democratic Party. Like you said, not to quadrant it like Southern Virginia, but pipelines are coming through everybody's backyard. So do you think overall the Democratic Party might need to shift more like, you know what, forget the donors for now, but yeah, pro-business is fine, but this is people's lives we're talking about.
Absolutely, and I think there's also a win-win here. This is not a zero-sum game. We're not saying no pipeline, no development, no fossil fuel, because the reality is we are still working on that. We have coal mines, we still have a lot of fossil industries. What we're saying is, for the amount of time and effort and money and resources it takes to build these pipelines that are useless, why don't we put that money towards solar, wind, energy? Because they'll create just as many, if not more jobs. It'll create amazing products. It'll create innovations that young kids growing up today are going to be working in fields that we don't even know what's going to be yet. And yet, instead of doing the new stuff, we're going back to the old stuff. And so that, to me, is where the disconnect is. We can actually have a win-win situation where we are dependent on new energy sources, cleaner, renewable energy sources, and create more jobs, and create an economy that's dependent on more innovative energy resources, and get young people to say, hey, I want to stay in Virginia because that's a place where cool things are happening, as opposed to saying, Virginia's full of coal and pipelines and fracking. So from my perspective, this is a situation where Democrats can not only take the lead in embracing new energy and new technology, and all the right things, but also to say that we're the party that not only believes in people's rights, but we're the party that believes in listening to people so that they give us ideas how the government should be doing better. And so this to me is a win-win for all of us to be on our side of the issue, and I'm really hoping that more friends of mine join us.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks for being here today.
Sure. We're going to grab him in a minute. He's, I believe, an attorney that's worked on this issue quite a lot. Hey, you're the attorney, correct? Cool. What's your name?
Jonathan Sokolow.
And what was interesting, what you were saying, was just the methane and all these chemicals and that kind of go beyond just the normal. Can you kind of tell the audience again, go in depth, like what are the things being burned for this pipeline in particular?
Well, what's being burned is methane, so you have to look at the entire infrastructure. So we talked a lot about pipelines today, but the process starts with the fracking in West Virginia and Pennsylvania predominantly, where they're putting chemical water, actually fracturing the rock to release the methane. The chemicals are the companies that are doing the fracking consider those chemicals that they're using proprietary, trade secrets, so they don't even tell us what chemicals are, but they're polluting the water on the front end there. Methane leaks as part of that whole process, and then you have the rest of the project, which includes the pipelines, which also leak, sometimes explode, and then at the very end, the whole purpose of getting the methane out of the ground is to burn it to create electricity. So, and when you burn methane, it causes greenhouse gases. It's actually much more powerful than carbon dioxide. So they like to call it a clean alternative to coal. It's exactly the opposite. It has a much worse effect in terms of greenhouse gases. Plus, when you burn it, it releases all sorts of toxins. So you're burning methane, you have benzene that gets into the air, you particulate matter, other toxic chemicals that get in people's lungs if you have asthma, other COPD or other respiratory diseases. It's going to aggravate that. So we're talking about air pollution. It's not just water pollution; it's air pollution as well.
You know what? Really, you look at FERC. A lot of people know the process. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It seems like they're granting, the permit or whatever the pipeline to go forward, and then you get eminent domain from the courts without there's not all the other permits have not been distributed yet.
That's correct.
So how is it can you explain the process? Because, people's land and their trees are being cut down. I just did a report from their property, and the deforestation is incredibly devastating, yet all the permits aren't even through.
Right, so they have the process sort of split up into a lot of different segments, which is what allows it to happen. So if FERC approves it, they give a notice to proceed, they get permission for tree cutting, they authorize eminent domain, the use of eminent domain. The companies then go to the landowners to try to negotiate voluntary eminent domain, pay them for the privilege of destroying their land. If the people don't agree to whatever proposal the pipeline company makes, then they sue them in federal court. That's what happened to the Terrys. That was the whole process. They lost. The Terrys lost in federal court on eminent domain. The pipeline company was given the right to use their property as an easement, which is why the Terrys went into the trees. They ended up coming out of the trees because the same federal court judge who granted the eminent domain easement said they were going to be held in contempt unless they got out of the trees by midnight on Saturday, which is why they came out Saturday afternoon.
Just for the common person, like my understanding of eminent domain was for like highways and schools and things that actually help like a wide population. How did pipelines become this thing of eminent domain? Because it's happening everywhere.
Well, it's a very good question. So, eminent domain has been around as long as our country's been around. The whole idea is that even though people own the land, ultimately it used to be the king, but now the government has certain rights to the land if it's in the public good. And for many years, public good was defined as something that, as you said, for creating highways, the state highway system is a perfect example of something that everybody would agree is a public good. Telephone wires, the Terrys in particular, granted an easement to have telephone wires put in and electrical wires put in Bent Mountain many years ago. They're not opposed to domain for the public good. They actually allowed that to happen so the 500 residents on Bent Mountain could get telephone service, could get electricity. But what's happened, excuse me, is that that's morphed into allowing eminent domain for all sorts of private uses. What happened in the case of the Mountain Valley and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, it's also happened with other pipelines, is companies like Dominion create subsidiaries, which are shell companies. They sign agreements with them, and then they go to FERC and they say, public need for this. How do we know there's a public need? Because this company has offered to buy the gas.
The LLCs they create.
That's great, and they're all wholly owned subsidiaries of Dominion, or in the case of Mountain Valley Pipeline, of EQT and its partners. So they create this fiction that there's an actual need. They go to FERC and say that there's a public need. Excuse me. And in the case of these two pipelines, as I mentioned earlier, the pipelines were approved by FERC by a 2-to-1 vote. The 2 Trump appointees voting in favor, the 1 Obama appointee voting against, Cheryl LaFleur, in which she said there is no public good here. And what's more, we shouldn't be approving any kind of pipeline based on these subsidiary agreements because it creates a fiction that there's even a need for the pipelines.
And it's my understanding, I could be wrong, but from what I've read, FERC has not rejected pipelines since like the 80s.
Yeah, the passage rate is roughly 98%, and it's almost always unanimous. That's why in the case of these two pipelines in Virginia, it was so extraordinary that there was a dissent. They issued the opinion at 7 o'clock on a Friday night. Tim Kaine came out the next day and said that these were very suspicious circumstances under which they were approved. He said there is no public need for these, and he says anytime a body such as FERC issues something on a late Friday night, they're doing it because they can't defend the reasoning. And I think that was the case in the case of these two pipelines.
And the compressor station you were talking about, in a predominantly black neighborhood. Obviously, we've seen, I was in East Chicago, Indiana. There's a lead crisis there. They basically built low-income housing on top of a lead smelting plant. So we see this in other communities, but this compressor station sounds like very, very dangerous to any community, much less a predominantly black community.
Yeah, the story of Union Hill is really an atrocity in the making. This is a community that was founded by freed slaves before the Civil War. Freedmen continued afterwards. The residents there are 85% African American, many of whom are descendants from the slaves who worked the plantations there. The name of the plantation there was called Variety Shade. It was a huge plantation in Buckingham County. The land that was purchased to build the compressor station was purchased by Dominion Energy for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline from Variety Shade, which is a trust created by the descendants of slave owners who owned the descendants of the people who now live there. I mean, it's just as stark as it can be. And these people live within a mile. 85% of the people within a mile of the compressor station are African American. They've got the methane that's going to be burned at this compressor station. And just so people understand, this isn't just some small compressor station you may see in suburbia somewhere, because those things are built every 40 to 60 miles. You're talking about a compressor station that's covering 300 miles of pipeline. It's massive. I think it's 57,000 horsepower. It's really unprecedented. And it's going to be running 24/7. It creates noise. It creates vibration. Their actual planned burning of methane to release some pressure. That's part of what compressor stations do, so that's going to release all these toxins in the air. There's leakages that can happen. They actually burn the methane deliberately, not only to release pressure, but to generate the power for the compressor station. So it's just terrible. And to sort of put the exclamation point on it, there's two African American churches, Baptist churches, within a mile of the compressor station that have been there since the Civil War. One of them started as an arbor church, which was an outdoor church that was used by African Americans in days of slavery to worship outside. That was where they were allowed. That was the only place they were allowed to worship. And one of those churches within a mile of the compressor station was formed as this arbor church. So it can't get any starker than that. The state can put a stop to that. The county can put a stop to it. They need an air permit in order to build that compressor station. Buckingham County has to issue that air permit. They have not done so yet, which is another opportunity for people to fight the pipeline. If there's no compressor station, there's no Atlantic Coast Pipeline. If Buckingham County stands up and says, we're not going to let this happen to this community, they can stop the compressor station.
My last question, obviously you're an attorney, so you got to be a little more careful than I, but I mean, I've covered enough of these. It seems like this whole process is a bit of a scam. I mean, FERC, literally, essentially, they get a budget, but the oil company pays for the majority of the studies. So you have oil companies basically hiring third-party contractors to do the environmental assessments for a lot of pipelines, and gee gosh jolly, the environmental assessments come back, no problem, no risk. This is what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline. So FERC basically has its costs covered by the oil companies for a lot of these environmental assessments. It seems, the Delaware Riverkeepers sued FERC a couple years ago for pipelines, and they said this isn't a regulatory agency, this is a rubber stamp. So broadening it out beyond Virginia, this gentleman said this is a national issue because it's happening everywhere. What could people kind of do to, peacefully fight back? Because it seems like the problem starts at FERC. Yes, states can do something, but federally, during the Trump administration, but even before the Trump administration, the main regulatory body seems to be acting as a rubber stamp.
Well, what I would say is there's long-term strategy and short-term strategy. The long-term strategy is that FERC needs to be reformed, and Tim Kaine has actually introduced legislation. He's going to continue to fight for that, to reform the whole FERC process to address the precise problems that you're talking about. That's a more long-term thing. The short-term problem, which are these two pipelines in Virginia, reconsideration has been requested at FERC. The chances of that are probably not great, but it's still a possibility. But state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, doesn't have to wait for a long-term solution to reforming FERC. They can stop these pipelines now. They can do it under the Clean Water Act, Section 401. They can do it, and Section 401 requires that the state review pipelines to determine whether they comply with the Commonwealth of Virginia own water quality standards, and if Virginia determines that they do not comply, the pipelines cannot be built. So there's politicians around who are trying to say it's a FERC issue, FERC needs to be reformed, and there's nothing the state can do. It's just simply not true. New York just stopped the Constitution pipeline using the exact same process that Virginia could use but is refusing to use so far.
Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
absolutely. So,
Thank you. I saw you were. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm going to be off in a minute. Before my battery dies, we got to go. I think we're going to be live again. I'll let you know about that. There's a march or a rally going on for this fight against the pipeline. If you want to support the reporting, you know how to do it. Patreon.com/Jordan Sheridan Reports. That support is helping us get out on the road, put the gas in the car. You know, we're fighting these gas pipelines right now. We need gas for the car. Cheap, shitty hotels that we've been staying at. And of course, we need funds to a professional cameraman. If you don't notice, we're not professional camera people. We're doing it ourselves. We need funds for lighting. If you watch my interview with Paula Jean Swearing last night in West Virginia, it kind of looked like a ghost story because we don't have the lighting. We need funds for more travel budget. We need funds not for ourselves, but to get out and do this reporting. I truly believe if you get cameras on these stories, if you get microphones on these stories, we can wake up enough people to apply pressure to the government. I've always said it. I said it at the Young Turks. I say it now. Politicians only do the right thing when you light a fire up their assholes. That's just the truth. Patreon.com/Jordan Sheridan Reports. $1 a month, $3 a month, $5 a month, $10 a month. Or if you can't do a monthly, you can do a one-time contribution. PayPal.me/Jordan Sheridan. PayPal.me/Jordan Sheridan. We've had several people for this trip leave considerable amounts of money so we could keep going to hotels and buying food and staying out on the road. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And we are using these funds to eventually hire more reporters, to eventually hire a camera person. We're starting this from the grassroots. We don't have funding right now. We do not have resources right now. We don't even have a working camera right now. We're doing this off my phone. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Patreon.com/Jordan Sheridan Reports. PayPal.me/Jordan Sheridan. Peace.